Let's see, is it recording? All right, cool. Hello, hello, hello. Thanks for joining, everybody. My name is Jason Xiao. I am the chapter leader for Multifamily Masters in San Jose. Multifamily Masters is a global grassroots community, that's there to connect, educate, and help people along their real estate journey. We have, I don't know the official count right now, but at least 50 chapters that I know of, and it's global. We have one in Dubai, apparently, and one in Hong Kong. Um, Before I introduce myself, I want to introduce our two other awesome chapter leaders. David, actually, let's go ladies first. Agnes, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Agnes. I'm the San Francisco chapter leader for Multifamily Masters. So I'm actually in Kabul right now, and the internet is not that strong. So I hope you guys can hear me. But I'm very excited to learn about ADUs from David.
Hi, I'm David Hudgens. Can you hear me? I have the Burbank chapter of Multifamily Masters, Burbank's in Los Angeles. And there's lots of ADUs on in LA, so I'm really interested to find out more about them. And I didn't even know you could do them for multifamily, so that's going to be really interesting to hear about. I'm really excited about the topic tonight.
Yeah, I mean, for multifamily, it's pretty powerful. I know Mark's got a case study, or actually two case studies from what he shared with me. The rules are a little bit different, but I'm sure we'll dive into it. As for me, my name is Jason. Like I said, I actually have two meetups. Only one of them is the official multifamily chapter in San Jose, but I have a separate one, more social, just pre-COVID. It's to grab a beer at a brewery kind of stuff. So I started my career in real estate basically when I was in college. The good old rich dad poor dad too early kind of stuff. Started house hacking with a 2-bedroom condo, and that was like 17 years ago. So right now I'm actually more of a developer, and I am licensed as well. And I'm a big fan and advocate of ADU. I think we touched on this a little bit before folks join. I think from a policy standpoint, we won't get too much into it, but it's a very good balance for homeowners, for investors, for the policymakers, that there's not so much of this pushback or NIMBYism or such a drastic change for some of the folks. So it makes a lot of sense, in my opinion, on a lot of fronts. But enough about me. I want to introduce our featured speaker, Mark Hogan here. Mark and we met a few years ago on a very difficult project that my brother-in-law has, that has like zero of our egress, but we got to know each other a little bit. He actually, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you helped the city of San Francisco write their ADU handbook, essentially. Is that right?
Yeah, and we assisted with the legislation when that was going through the Board of Supervisors also.
Yeah, so take it away, Mark, wherever you like. How did you get into architecture and the whole ADU space?
Sure. And am I set up to share my screen also? Whenever I want to. Okay. I think you're muted, Jason.
Yeah, sorry. I made you co-host, so you should be able to share.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I'm based in San Francisco. Our firm, though, has an office in San Francisco and a second office in Los Angeles. We don't just do ADUs, but it's a big part of our practice. And as Jason said, we were involved in writing the ADU handbook for the city of San Francisco back in 2014. So my partner Ian and I had a long background doing designing multifamily housing, ground up multifamily, affordable and market rate. And one of the first projects we worked on together when we started our own office was a project with the San Francisco Planning Department, where we had responded and won an RFP to develop a ADU handbook. And no one really knew what it was going to look like, because ADUs weren't really legal at the time when we were writing it. And there was a small trial area in one part of the city when Scott Wiener, prior to being a state senator, had enacted, it was like a 500-foot radius around a a transit station where that you could build ADUs. And nobody really, I think there were like 2 ADUs built in a couple of years in that area. But once we wrote the handbook and started doing outreach, people could see that this was a pretty valuable tool, especially as the housing crisis was sort of intensifying in 2015. And the city realized that they had to do more, and there was not a lot of community opposition to this type of development compared to other types of infill development that we're all familiar with. So we finished the handbook, and then it got involved in working with two different supervisors on the legislation and the tweaks to the legislation that would then become citywide ADU legislation, which allowed multifamily ADUs. It basically allowed additional units anywhere on residential lots in San Francisco. And a lot of the thinking that went into that local legislation became part of the state level legislation that went into effect at the beginning of 2020. Once we started doing that outreach, most of the people that approached us to design ADUs were multifamily property owners. Not that many single family owners were interested at first. The multifamily owners clearly saw an opportunity to add value to a lot of these buildings that they had owned for decades. Most of them were well capitalized and could afford the construction costs, and had a bigger appetite for risk than the single family homeowners did in San Francisco at the time. So we built a big part of our practice doing those type of units. At the same time, we're still doing new multifamily projects, renovations, co-housing, supportive and affordable housing, and commercial work as well. And we've also seen a lot of opportunities to combine the ADU laws with other types of development. So someone might be, we worked on a repositioning an apartment building into co-housing and used an ADU expansion of that building to add an extra floor of co-housing units. And so there's a lot of ways you can use the ADU law in conjunction with new construction now. So we've really been thinking creatively and kind of helping people figure out how to maximize the potential of these existing buildings. It's just a picture of our San Francisco office and a couple of the commercial projects we've been working on. So when people think of ADU, the sort of detached, idyllic backyard unit is typically what comes to mind. Los Angeles just had a major PR push of their pre-designed ADU program, and they're all kind of, most of them are like pretty fancy detached backyard units, and so that's what people really think of. The picture on the right, though, is the reality of a lot of the things that we're working on, which is multifamily ADUs, where you can add multiple units at the same time. Usually within the footprint of the building, but you could also do some detached units as well. And so I want to run through just...
Actually, sorry, Mark,
yep.
If you might have a slide on this and we might jump back and forth a little bit. I was hoping we could set the groundwork a little bit to talk about the different kinds of ADUs first before we go into the ADU laws, just so that people know when you're referring to a detached versus a JADU or JD, however people call it, they have a little better reference on what you're...
Yeah, I could do that. So there's sort of categories and then there's subcategories of all those categories, but the sort of the two biggest would be either attached ADUs or detached ADUs. So the attached units are usually in the envelope of like a garage or a storage space or some kind of unused space in an existing building. So in a multifamily building, it's usually parking spaces, like an old community room, a storage area. Sometimes it's like a basement because we have a lot of sloped lots, in California, all over the state, where you end up with sort of a large walkout basement that maybe was never developed anything when the building was built. So and then in single family, the attached units are usually in the garage of the house, either a carport you're filling in, or a attached garage, something like that. The detached units, similar for multifamily and single family, are either conversion of an existing freestanding structure, like you have a carport, you have a garage, you have a storage building behind your house that you're converting, that that was not residential occupancy. And then in that category, the other type of detached unit would be a ground up kind of tiny house structure, or something like the Abodu house that I've got here on the screen, where you have enough space that you're building a completely new structure. And a lot of people think of tiny houses when they think of that, but it could be a fairly substantial building, 1,200 square foot building in some cases. I think we've seen a lot of cases, and this was common in Oakland in particular under the previous version of the state ADU law, where people were essentially just building a second single family home on the lot and then renting out both houses separately. So, when we talk about what's allowed under the state ADU laws, the rules are different depending on which exact type of unit we're talking about. So there's setback rules that typically apply to ground up buildings, but we've also sort of a nuance, but we found that a couple of cities are applying those to existing buildings. I'm not completely sure whether that complies with state law or not, but that's happening. But in general, the height limits and setbacks are geared towards the new construction ADUs. The buildings that have space internal to them for adding units, those units are kind of usually grandfathered in by the footprint of the existing building. So like the building on the right here on the screen, we put those 3 units into tuck under parking that was under the back of that building. And we were able to fill that entire space with 3 studios.
Okay, great, thanks.
Great. So I'll walk through the state law, because this is what's allowing people to add all of these units. So one thing we didn't talk about was the junior accessory dwelling unit, and this is not something that's as valuable to an investor unless you're maybe doing some kind of a house hack with a JDU. But a JDU is more like a rental suite, like kind of like a master suite, maybe with a small kitchen that isn't treated as a full dwelling unit in the code. And so often the JDU will kind of be like a ground floor master suite that has its own door to the exterior, and then maybe some sort of compact kitchen, but it doesn't have to have a full kitchen. And you can rent that out separately, and you could build that in addition to a detached unit or a garage unit or something as well.
Yeah, and if I may interject,
yeah.
I think what you're trying to say too, this is more for owner occupants, because there is certain cities, they don't have this requirement. I think like Long Beach is one of them, but most of the time, you're gonna have to record a covenant that says like, hey, yeah, I'm owner occupying this. It's not just for rent kind of thing. So
yeah, and I'll get to it in a second, but cities are not allowed to enforce an occupancy requirement on other types of ADUs, but they are allowed to enforce them on the JDUs.
yeah.
And it's very common to see them for those units. So the state law was signed by the governor in 2019, and this most recent one went into effect January of 2020. These are the highlights. And it's a very broad piece of legislation, but these are kind of the most important parts of it. When they wrote this, and most of this was in AB 68, they realized that there were a lot of bad actor cities that were finding ways to prevent people from adding ADUs under the previous round of ADU legislation, which had just been passed a few years before that. There were cities putting really extreme impact fees on ADUs, like on the order of like tens of thousands of dollars, like specifically just to prevent people from adding units. There were, parking requirements that made the project impossible. There were size requirements. I mean, it just kind of went on and on and on. So a lot of what they put in here was put in to kind of thwart local municipalities' attempts to prevent these from being built. So they removed size limits so that cities couldn't use really, really small size requirements to make them unattractive. So the state saying you can build 4-foot setbacks on your property lines, 800 square feet, 16 feet tall. You can actually go larger than 800 square feet. I think there's I think it's like a 1,200 square foot is the,
yeah, I think it's 1,200.
They can't limit it smaller than 1,200, but you have to be able to build at least 800, assuming you're meeting the building code. And then there's fee waivers up to like 750 square feet. ADUs created by conversions are granted kind of automatic planning approval. It's not discretionary. Even if you have a garage that was, had a building permit when it was built and it's no longer complying with the planning code because they put in a setback requirement at some point, you can still convert that. One of the biggest things, and the thing that I usually have to, when I'm talking to like some new client or a group like this, I usually have to say it like 3 or 4 times, is that there's no parking requirements if you're within a half mile of a bus stop anywhere in the state. And this means that not only are there no parking requirements for the new units, but you can take out existing parking to put in the units. So it doesn't really matter what the required parking ratio is for the site, what the zoning is. None of it matters. If you're putting in ADUs, you can take out parking. And just to kind of quickly illustrate this, what happens when you remove parking requirements? This is an apartment building this is projects under construction right now. The owner was able to put in 6 units in all these garages that are facing both the street and kind of the side driveway. And so they just left a small garage kind of back at one end. And had there been a parking requirement, none of these units would have been possible. So a 26 unit building turns into a 32 unit building. The state ADU law also prohibits lot coverage, floor area ratios, and open space regulations that would prevent you from building at least one 800 square foot dwelling unit. So most cities, like if you look at San Francisco's planning code, for example, they rezoned the whole city in the 70s with like rear setbacks that basically mirrored everything that had already been built to make sure nobody could build anything else. And similar things happen in many other cities where they removed multifamily zoning, they increased setbacks, they increased open space requirements, particularly in the 70s. So this says you need to be able to build at least one unit, kind of regardless of anything else. The time period for considering an ADU is 60 days. So once you submit a complete application, you're supposed to be able to get a permit within 60 days.
Has that been the case, or has it kind of gone out the window because of COVID? Or
I haven't seen that anywhere. So I think because of COVID, every building department is working remotely. They've had to come up with fairly elaborate ways of submitting and responding to comments on drawings. Some cities are handling it better than others. I think some of the smaller municipalities are actually handling it quite a bit better than the larger cities that have a really big volume of plans to review. We definitely we have a project in LA where they lost the drawings for a couple months before and then we got a surprise extra set of comments when somebody found them. I mean, so it's been very hectic without people actually being in their offices. A lot of the kinks seem to be worked out now, but it took quite a while to get to the point where we're at right now. It is supposed to be non-discretionary though, which is also really important. So, you know, they can't start applying sort of arbitrary aesthetic standards to your project. You know, there's I think there's some opening for planning feedback, but it really just is supposed to be checking it for, you know, sort of basic compliance with those requirements I laid out and kind of making sure you meet the building code. 5-year moratorium on the owner occupancy requirements. As we discussed a little bit earlier, a lot of cities had sort of blanket owner occupancy requirements for any ADU. Those are gone until at least 2025, unless that gets extended. Meaning that anything built between now and 2025 can't have a deed restriction on it. Then they could start doing that again in 2025. But if your project's built now, you don't have to worry about that long term. No impact fees for ADUs under 750 square feet, and the fees over that are proportional to the size of the ADU. Prohibition on HOA interference with ADU additions. And that's a particularly big deal in the suburbs because there's a lot of single family home communities, you know, with an HOA on them, you know, that often can have sort of heavy-handed design review power, et cetera. Not to say that the HOA probably couldn't make things difficult, but they can't prohibit ADUs. And then there is a provision to bring unpermitted ADUs up to code over a 5-year period. I haven't heard that much more about how that works. We've been involved in some ADU legalizations in San Francisco and Los Angeles, mostly through like local processes. The biggest one, I think, to me is that multifamily ADUs are allowed statewide. At least one ADU could be created, and you can build up to 25% of the existing unit count. And so that's got to be within unused non-residential spaces in the building. You can't like carve all your units up or do split units beyond density. This has to be in, you know, parking areas, storage rooms, you know, all those types of spaces that were not originally residential use. And then up to 2 ground up detached ADUs on a property with an existing multifamily dwelling. This part is a little bit confusing and it's been interpreted differently in different cities. Doing 1 is fairly easy. Doing 2, you know, they can impose some more restrictions on them. And some cities are letting you convert accessory buildings within that 25% rule. So if you had a lot with 100 units on it and a bunch of carports, some cities might let you convert the carports to 25 additional units. But others will just say, no, those don't count within the existing structures rule. They're not in the multifamily building. So those are just attached. You can only convert 2 carports. So that piece of it was not very well written in the state law and takes a little bit of digging around with the local planning department. And then I'm going to just go over a little bit of the implementation in Bay Area and LA area, because some cities have changed their local planning code to align with the state law, or they've even gone beyond the state law, and others are just relying on interpretations of state law. So like in the Bay Area, Oakland has created new intake forms and they have a whole permitting process for ADUs that's separate from other dwelling units, but they haven't done anything in the planning code, you know, different than what's allowed by state law. San Francisco has issued guidance on applying the new state laws, but the planning code has not been updated. San Jose has updated their ADU checklist, and they have what's called the ADU ally. So they have a person there that helps people move their permits through permitting. Their laws are pretty aligned with the state. San Mateo County, our office just did a set of pre-reviewed plans for a whole bunch of different cities for pre-reviewed detached units. Most of the cities there, though, have not gone beyond what's allowed, the 16-foot, the 4-foot setbacks. we are doing some work in Pacifica, which is like a small community just south of San Francisco, where they've decided to allow 2-story detached units, and that's something you do see in some jurisdictions around the state. Down in Southern California, City of Los Angeles has made planning code updates, but they're relying on a memo that they issued last year for multifamily ADUs. So it's a very long memo that you can get online, and it came out just before the pandemic hit. And I just talked to a senior planner there the other day, and it sounds like they're not going to actually edit the planning code to account for multifamily ADUs for a couple of years. So for now, we're pretty much stuck with what's in that memo, the interpretations they provided. Santa Monica updated their code, and they're allowing 2-story units on multifamily lots, which is huge because you can add units above carports on alleys, which are really common in Santa Monica. So we're doing a number of projects there where we're putting in two units, keeping all the existing parking, and then getting the 2 units on top, which is really attractive for property owners who have parking leases on those spaces. And then a lot of small jurisdictions haven't even considered multifamily ADUs, particularly in Southern California. We're working with one jurisdiction that took like 3 years to write their single family ADU code, and then they have to throw it out when the state law passed at the beginning of 2020 because any kind of development was so contentious. But now they're sort of facing multifamily owners saying, hey, we can take out all this parking and add 25% more units. And so they've been open to negotiating additional height, like 2nd-story units to allow us to retain parking, et cetera. And I think that there's going to be more opportunities to do that with other cities. Wanted to kind of illustrate the difference that these state laws really make. And ADUs were not a thing at all, 10 years ago. Just a couple getting built, in most cities, via like excess zoning capacity. So in the entire city of Los Angeles, and prior to 2017, they were doing 100 to 200 ADUs a year. In the year that law passed, it jumped to 23, 26, and then they almost doubled that again in 2018. And that was prior to any of the multifamily stuff coming into effect. I haven't seen the numbers yet for 2020, and I think because of COVID, things are going to be pretty depressed because all these laws went into effect and then everything pretty much shut down immediately.
I mean, that's still encouraging to see, right? Like,
yeah.
I mean, I think this is the part where it's kind of mentioning, I mean, these numbers probably barely putting a dent in the housing units that we need, but to see that it went 10x and then double fold, that I guess as to a certain extent, every little bit helps, and
it does, and these units come on the market so much faster than multifamily units.
Yeah, because like stuff we're doing sometimes takes 3 to 5 years. When you're talking about, I mean, let's say 3 months in planning and 6 months to build it, like, you can get it out to market in less than a year, maybe.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and there are, when you get to the multifamily scale, things get more challenging, especially on the construction end when you start digging into some of the existing conditions. But, in some cases you're adding the equivalent, like I had a note up there that I forgot to mention, but we're working on a 42 unit ADU project right now. And so it's just like a huge suburban site where we're maxing out the 25% in tuck under parking. And, so we're effectively building like an extra apartment building just through the ADU law through a totally non-discretionary process.
You're saying the existing building is 46 units, or you're
No, we're adding 46 units.
Oh my gosh. So 25%, so it used to be
we have
like 200 units.
It's like 170 something unit building, so we can get 42 units by the 25%, and then we can get another 4 detached because it's 2 parcels.
Nice. And sorry, you might have this in your slides too. Can you touch on a little bit the overall process? I mean, we were talking about the planning department and all that. what are the stuff they're gonna ask to see? You know, do you need as-builds? Do you need MEP structure? Like, how does that process or submittal process work?
It depends quite a bit on what your local jurisdiction typically requires for building permits. You know, like some cities provide a pretty good checklist of what exactly you have to submit. I think like Oakland and Santa Monica both have a checklist you can download that tell you what needs to go in your drawing set. You do need structural, definitely. So typically the best case scenario with a multifamily ADU project would be you hire an architect who can bring in those other consultants and figure out which consultants you would need. And so it would typically at a minimum be structural and a consultant to run Title 24. You might actually need MEP engineers, kind of depending on how complicated. If you're just, typically you're not adding gas to these units, you're kind of doing everything electric with mini splits, but you know, sometimes you might have to do an electrical upgrade to the building. You know, you might have substandard plumbing that needs to be upgraded, you know, especially if you're adding a lot more units. So, you know, case by case. On the smaller projects, you usually don't need a huge consultant team if you're hiring an architect who's kind of familiar with these type of projects. And then a lot of the MEP can be design build as long as it's kind of, you know, what's sort of specified is in line with reality. The structural is needed because, you know, like a lot of buildings with tuck under parking or also have a soft story. And so you've got to address the soft story as you're putting in the units. And that's just part of the, like many cities have a soft story regulation, Los Angeles, Oakland, San Francisco. But this is actually separate from that. So even if you're in a jurisdiction that doesn't have a soft story regulation, the building code is going to require that because of the change of use. So you're going to have to kind of address that, and you know, often you're probably moving some columns in the garage. You're doing other structural work. But yeah, it's pretty fast. Like we usually can turn around plans and, I don't know, even with a lot of back and forth with the owner in like 3 months, you know, and get them in for permits. You usually need as-built of at least the ground floor, but it kind of depends on the jurisdiction and the project. You also often need a survey if you're going to build detached units. If you're converting existing space, you really generally don't need a survey, but if you're going to be building new stuff in the backyard and you're going to be building close to the property line, most cities are going to want to see a survey.
And this might be a little niche, but I do know, since we're in California, it does come into play from time to time, or since you're working on a project in Pacifica. How does the Coastal Commission come into play? I mean, is it still the state laws, regulation trumps everything else, or do they get to have says on?
Coastal does come into play. Luckily, our Pacifica project is not in the coastal zone. Some cities have, and I'm not 100% sure this is legal, but I know that I think Oxnard has banned ADUs in the coastal zone completely. Some cities send them through like whatever their typical coastal process is. Like we have a project in Venice that's going to have to go through that review. Some cities just permit the ADUs in the coastal zone just as ADUs. And it kind of depends on what their local coastal plan is and how they're interpreting it. I think the Coastal Commission, I think there was like a statewide recommendation that, you know, that cities allow ADUs in the coastal zone, especially if it's a conversion of an existing structure, because the development has already happened. It's not a new structure. I think that the freestanding ADUs though might be a little bit trickier. And so in LA specifically, and I just had a discussion with a planner about this, they're definitely amenable to adding the ADUs in the coastal zone, but there's a big, they can require you keep parking in the coastal zone. Like the coastal says that you know, the city can impose like a parking requirement and the ADU program doesn't trump the parking requirement. So they can waive it, but then there's often like a lot of pushback from there's more opportunity for community input too if it has to go through the coastal process versus if it's just a regular ADU. So it's kind of a little bit riskier of a project than, you know, you're just straightforward 2-month approval that you might get if you weren't out in that area.
Got it. Yeah, and I mean, for any questions, feel free to answer as specifically or as generally you like. I know every city is different, so you know your mileage might vary. Check with your local planners on a lot of these questions.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that a lot of cities, they just don't even have an answer necessarily because they never really considered that people were going to add units to multifamily buildings and that they were really, really focused on single family. And then this just comes in as a giant surprise when you call them. Oh yeah, here's the really shocking permit application numbers where we went from like 300 to 3,800 in LA, and we went from 41 to almost 600 in San Francisco in 2 years. I think that previous slide, we're at 20% of the housing permits in LA were ADUs in 2018. And I think that's going to go up, especially as it becomes harder for some new construction to pencil out. And so this is that first case study that you mentioned at the beginning. This is on Union Street in San Francisco. It's a property type that's really common all over the state, though, where you have garages in the back of the main building fronting a carport. The whole yard was paved, so people kind of drive under the front building and park in that tuck under parking or park in the carport. We did this project under the local ADU law, but it's pretty similar to what's allowed under the state law right now. The owner went from having 12 units in the front building to having 17 units at the end of the project. So that's the interior of one of the carport units. The carport, obviously in that photo on the left, and then this is what it looked like on the inside when we were done. Reinforced the whole back of the building. So this was combined
But that
with
photo on the left is what the same from a different angle. You guys filled that in.
Yeah, so if you look on the left of this before photo, there were just like a bunch of garage. There's a common garage with a bunch of doors into it, kind of tuck under style. And we filled in that whole wall, sort of combined it with a seismic retrofit, and then added 3 studio units into the parking spaces that were under the back of the building. And then the rear building was converted into 2 one-bedrooms. And so the picture on the right is one of the studios in the main building. Doesn't look weird, you know, just looks like a regular apartment, actually probably a lot nicer than a lot of the units upstairs. Ended up with really high ceilings here just because the ground floor happened to be very tall.
How big is that unit? Like 600 square feet or?
No, this unit's only 400 something, I think. Okay. It's kind of a common, and I have a floor plan I'll show you later, but a really common unit type in these conversions is a sort of largish deep studio with like a nested bedroom in the back that's not actually in a separate room, you know, because it doesn't have a window. But it you know, we divided up the space with that sort of wall with the closet in the middle. So you actually do have a more private sleeping area. So people, if they're coming over, aren't just walking into your bedroom. Yeah, and that's another view of the unit on the right there. So it's got a small but pretty nicely appointed kitchen, living room, and small bedroom area, and then the bathroom's way in the back. And then the other units in the carport were sort of the more premium units, and those have private patios, you know, separate bedroom. I think these units are more like 500 square feet. But the outdoor space in the private entrance is really, really huge amenity right now. You know, tenants have been shying away from, you know, large apartment buildings with a lot of shared stairs and elevators. And so this building the residents can walk through like an open air passageway right up to their own kind of personal front door, and every unit has a patio in front of it. So this is what we had started with, 6 parking spaces across the back in a carport. We had 4 spaces and some kind of storage area around the spaces in the main building. And then there's a number of parking spaces in the front of the building that we ended up keeping for some of the tenants upstairs who still had parking. And then this is what we ended up with, 2 small 1-bedrooms in the back, converted that whole paved area in the center to that shared courtyard you saw the photo of earlier. And then the 3 studios in the front building. I've carved out new areas for things like trash and storage. Had to make some upgrades to the exiting along the bottom there in the front. We need to provide 2 exits out of the courtyard. You know, but it was a pretty straightforward project. Didn't run into any kind of major surprises during construction. You know, because it was under our local ADU law, the carport had to stay the original height, which required some real structural kind of gymnastics. We had to do a little bit of excavation to sort of get more headroom in there. Under the state law, you'd be able to lift the roof of the carport, you know, because there's a 16-foot height limit. In San Francisco, at the time they were requiring us to stay within the envelope. But yeah, I mean, this was completed kind of late summer, early fall last year. And construction was about a year on this, maybe a little more. It got dragged out a little bit because of COVID, because there was a bunch of work stoppages, you know, during the early half of 2020.
And I'm curious, you may not know the answer to some of these, say, non-design questions, but I'm hoping maybe at least anecdotally through your clients, you hear, like, for the folks that used to park there, what happened to them? Or
well, in this particular building, they were already not renting to tenants for the most part. So in San Francisco specifically, like, a lot of owners don't really like renting parking to tenants because it gets it sort of gets tied up into the local rent control regulations, because you can't remove somebody from the parking space without it being considered a partial eviction. Like, you can't just not renew someone's parking lease once you give it to them if they're a tenant. If it's an outside parker, you have a lot more freedom. You can just kind of end that lease at any time. So some savvier owners had just kind of intentionally not been renting to residents for a while. And so in this case, I think they had 2 spaces rented to tenants. So they moved those people into the front 2 remaining parking spaces, and then they terminated the parking leases for all the outside parkers. The thing that's happening now in San Francisco is people are doing buyouts of the parking spaces, or paying for the tenant to have parking in another building nearby, in order to free up the spaces to add ADUs. We're doing other projects where, you know, the building might have access parking. It's actually not that uncommon, especially in buildings that are not managed super well, to have, you know, a bunch of parking where the owner is just storing stuff. We have a client we just did a feasibility study for, where he has a car collection, so he's keeping like at least 1 car at every property he owns, and then storing a bunch of other stuff. And so he basically has like no tenant cars parked in any of his garages. Granted, it'll be a separate challenge having him get rid of all that stuff when he puts in the ADUs. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of opportunities. I think in parts of LA where, you know, everybody in the building owns a car and is used to parking in the building all the time, it's definitely going to be more challenging. I think that's why, like in Santa Monica, for example, being able to build above the garage solves that problem. pretty easily. And it's also not that hard to rent, especially if you're in a sort of central part of Santa Monica. It's not that hard to rent small units without parking. In LA, it really depends, but we definitely see a lot of owners removing at least half their parking to add additional units.
Yeah, it's definitely something to be mindful of. I mean, I think we might have talked about this privately. Like, I have a hard time in LA where, I mean, it's the same thing with TOC incentives, right? Like you can provide only half the parking that you need by code, but like a lot of people, once they finish, they're like, I'm having a heck of a time leasing these units because there's no parking. And I mean, I didn't know about the rent control aspect of for parking spaces. That's good to know to stay ahead of or to be mindful of.
Yeah.
Real quick, who here is getting some value here, guys? Like type in the chat box, just put in value or $ if you are. But let's keep this going. Feel free to put in your questions in the chat box. I'm gonna make sure we save time to get to all of them. I think Mark has one more case study. Oh yeah, this one.
I'll just flip through this really quickly. This is just a smaller multifamily building at a corner in San Francisco. Unfortunately, when I generated the PDF, it mangled the photo of the existing condition, but there used to be garages where that guy's walking the dog, and there he is walking his dog again down the other street. There was another garage on this side. So we created a 2-story unit on one side and then a very large 1-bedroom on the other. Here we had like a weird storage room above the garage that became the second floor of the unit. So that's the entry. You walk into a very large living room with a kitchen kind of attached in the back, and then a separate bedroom next to it. Okay, lost. There's supposed to be another photo of this one. But anyway, this was sort of like the whole project just moved very smoothly. The owner hired us before they even closed on the building. You know, by the time they closed, I think we almost had the permit ready to file, got approved in 3 months, started construction. Within a year of closing on the building, they had 2 additional units. One unit rented for, I don't know, like $5,500 a month, and the other unit was $3,000 or $3,500 a month. You know, rented very quickly, super desirable neighborhood in Glen Park in San Francisco near BART station. You know, and they were specifically looking for a building to add units to, and nobody else at the time really saw the value because it was kind of a little bit before this became a really popular strategy here. And, you know, some of the current challenges, varying interpretations of the state ADU law, slow permitting because of COVID, increasing construction costs. But I would add that ADUs kind of have an advantage here, because if you're building in the existing building, you're actually going to have a lot less raw material cost, you know, than if you're building a totally new structure. Specifically in LA, they haven't updated the planning code to include multifamily ADUs. Similar situation in San Francisco. They haven't updated it yet, and they're relying on a matrix, which is extremely confusing. You know, we're seeing rent dropping in urban areas. Kind of that's finally starting to reverse. You know, especially you're seeing that in the Bay Area, units starting to fill up again. In some cases, I think owners have used that to keep parking spaces vacant here. You know, when people move out, they're intentionally releasing the units without the parking to free up space to add units. In some cases, kind of using the vacancies to do other value adds, you know, add bedrooms to units in conjunction maybe with adding ADUs. A lot of demand in suburban areas like that Pacifica project I mentioned. They only had 3% vacancy throughout COVID. Basically no one moved out, a lot of demand still. And also sort of just the long lead time of getting these on the market means that most people are kind of looking beyond the pandemic and trying to, you know, think about getting the units aren't going to be on the market for at least a year, probably more. Great. So if anyone wants to ask questions, discussion. I don't know if there's anything in the chat, but definitely be willing
Yeah,
to.
I'll call on some of the folks, but I'll keep off. I'll kick it off with a couple. We talk about, and again, if these are like design questions that you're not too familiar, you can punt them. It's fine.
Sure.
But I wanted to touch on this. I know multifamily is usually, it's a garage, but for the detached units, can you just riff or talk a little bit about the trade-offs between prefab and stick-built ADU, or just construction in general?
Sure. Yeah, we've done a ton of research into prefab. I've talked to kind of the whole range of prefab fabricators. We went out with a Bodoo when they had right when they finished their prototype, and we looked at their unit. And then I've talked to some of the lower end fabricators that kind of cater more to like the trailer park market as well. And there's a number of those manufacturers in state. They're actually the sort of lowest end prefab companies are super busy right now. But they're typically building units for single family homeowners that are probably outside of major cities. On the multifamily sites, doing detached prefab units is often really challenging because getting the prefab unit onto the site is often impossible. They're typically rolled off the back of a truck. Some companies use a crane. The crane, though, is extremely expensive. If you've got power lines, you can't crane the unit in. I mean, there's just a lot of site constraints with prefab. Prefab works pretty well if you're on, a 6,000 square foot single family home lot, where you've got space all around the house to sort of navigate something in there. Or prefab works are totally new construction where you've got a blank slate, but if you have a 3-story apartment building, it's kind of hard to get the modular unit behind it. And we're also seeing that it doesn't really save that much money. You're saving some time. You're maybe saving 10% in hard costs, but you're also potentially getting in a huge queue waiting for the factory to have time to fabricate your unit. A lot of them have like a 5+ month wait. And
Right.
you're probably not going to want to confirm your order until you have your permit in hand. It would be pretty risky to put down the deposit on the modular units before you've actually gotten the permit in case something went wrong. Yeah, we haven't yet found a site where the owner elected to go with prefab sort of after doing all the research.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of seeing the same thing in both ADU and regular constructions too, that prefab, unless it's just such a flat standard lot, and I actually didn't think about the whole craning aspect of it. I mean, I know they have to be delivered on a truck, but like they're made in a factory. If you're off a little bit, like you can't really, it's much harder to fix it on site. And maybe, I think, yeah, best case I've heard 10-15% savings, but the time does make a big difference. So
the time makes a big difference, but a lot of the things that you end up waiting for are not in the scope of the prefab fabricator. So
right, yeah, that's a good point. You got to trench the sewer line or whatever, and
right. Well, and if you have to do an electrical upgrade or add meters, like a lot of times the utility company is going to be a lot slower than your GC, and you may end up having a completed unit, but you can't get your C of O because the power isn't turned on yet.
right. Okay, well, I'm gonna go through the questions in the chat box, and I'll ask you to turn on your mic to ask a question if you're comfortable as well. I might get the name wrong, but Lakeisha, would you like to turn on your mic to ask?
Hi. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
I actually have a bunch of questions. I'm super excited and thank you guys for sharing this information. Question is, I have a home in LA that has an illegal garage conversion. that I would like to do an ADU on, get permitted to make an ADU. Do you guys work with that as well? Would you be able to help?
Yeah, I mean, feel free to reach out to us. We've actually done, we've done one very complicated 13-unit legalization in LA, and we're working on another one in an apartment building. The single-family home one, might be better to just do as a new, quote unquote, new ADU versus trying to go through the city has a UDU, like undocumented dwelling unit program, which is very cumbersome to navigate and expensive. But sure, feel free to reach out to me and we could talk to you. You might just be able to add that as a unit and bring it up to code.
Okay, great. David, would you like to ask your question about driving and parking?
So I know you've covered for some of the smaller multifamilies that people are turning garages into ADUs. What about larger properties? Because if people are driving less and you need less parking, are landlords utilizing the parking garages and starting to convert those into more units?
Yeah, the Pacifica project I mentioned where we're adding 40 plus units, they realized the site was, well, the owner bought it with the intention of adding ADUs. They were kind of committed to keeping like a 1-to-1 parking ratio. It was parked at more than 1-to-1. And we helped them during a feasibility phase look at where we could add some extra surface parking on site to kind of offset the ADUs. But I think they recognized pretty early that someone moving into a really small 1-bedroom unit is probably not going to have like 2 or 3 cars anyway. Especially moving forward, that there is less demand for parking maybe than there used to be in a lot of these locations. So yeah, we are definitely seeing that. It's obviously easier on more urban sites. You're seeing it, in near downtown LA, you're seeing it in San Francisco, you're seeing it in Oakland, San Jose. You get kind of farther out in the suburbs, it's less common to take out a huge percentage of the parking. Yeah.
Xander, do you have a follow-up question? Or I feel like your question we kind of touched on or addressed earlier on the parking thing.
It was also about parking, but more specifically kind of on the landlord side, is there a specific process or protocol if the parking is part of the lease? How easy is it to get the tenants out of the parking? Or I think you mentioned that, you've seen some cases that the landlord would buy out the tenants on the parking spaces.
It depends on which city you're in. So like in LA, you would have to give them a reduction in rent because it'd be a reduction of services. San Francisco has gone a step farther and they consider it a partial eviction if you take away someone's parking space. So in San Francisco specifically, seeing a lot of property owners that are buying people out in cash, to get them to sign off on removing their parking space. If there's parking in someone's lease though, there's probably almost anywhere going to have to be some kind of compensation for taking the parking away.
Okay. Great. And for the Union Street case study, I think Carl was asking, do you know if all those units are rented now or?
I don't know. I know they're putting them on the market. I think the utilities, as I mentioned a second ago, held up getting the C of O slightly after they had actually finished the work on site. So I haven't checked back in with the owner to see if they were rented or not. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I had to take some assumptions on that, but say like, you added 7 units, you added
6 units.
6 units.
Added 5 units, 12 to 17. We added 5 units.
Right, and if you took say 3,000 a unit for rent, some kind of reasonable 30 to 40% expense ratio, and like a 5% cap rate, you basically increase that property value somewhere between like 2 to 2.5, maybe even $3 million.
Yeah, and that's yeah, it's probably in the like $500,000 a unit range. And that's actually what buildings in this neighborhood are typically selling for. So yeah, you've added a huge amount of value. And in places with rent control, even though the units are rent controlled, you're adding 5 units at market rent.
Market rate, yeah.
Yeah, you're not in a lot of these existing buildings, half of the units are like severely rent controlled back to 20 years ago. So the units are, based on the cap rate, are extremely valuable.
Right. And then there's a question about converting a permitted guest house into an ADU. Do you want to ask that question, Sophia?
Oh yeah, so we have a permitted guest house that we bought. Well, when we bought the house, it had a permitted guest house from like the 70s. And we want to convert it into an ADU so that we can actually rent it out separate from the main house. And Ryan kind of spoke to this, but I was wondering if there was any way that I could find out if we could convert it fairly easily, or if I could get an inspector out to understand what had to be done before I decided to move forward with it. I wasn't sure if there was an option to do that.
If it's already permitted, why do you want or
so
need
I
to
can't have a
convert it?
kitchen and I can't rent it out separately. As a guest house, yeah. So
I think you'd have to, is it your own property? Is it an owner occupied property?
It is right now.
I think your only option, at least under state law, would be to convert it to a JDU, because if it's already residential space, the ADU program requires it to be a conversion of non-residential space. You might have a local law that would allow it to become an ADU, but the state law says it has to be non-residential.
But JADU has a limitation where it can't be bigger than 500 square feet, right?
Well, how big is the guest house, I guess, is the question.
423 square feet.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, it's probably okay then.
That's actually something new that I've never heard, because we were told that we could by planners actually.
Well, that's why I'm saying you really need to go to the local jurisdiction, because there's things in the state law where a lot of municipalities are going beyond the state has like a minimum set of requirements of what they have to do. And then a lot of cities are choosing to go beyond that and allow other things.
Actually,
I think we can connect after this to get some of the more specifics. So
yeah, sounds good.
Let's see. Mark, you cool with sharing the presentation with folks?
Sure. Yeah, I could give you a PDF afterwards.
Okay. And then I'm going to skip. It's the same person that asked the question, so I want to give everybody a fair chance before I come back to it. Do you know how rent control applies to the new ADUs? It sounds like it's just whatever the existing properties rules apply, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably some different local interpretations, but I've been told by a land use attorney that if you're adding units, basically anywhere in the state, if you're adding units to a building that's already rent controlled and it was built, before rent control went into effect, that the new units will likely be rent controlled. And there may be, I'm not a land use attorney, but that has been conveyed to me, and that's how, like, San Francisco, for example, and I believe Santa Monica have interpreted it.
Okay, great. And I'm jumping around a little bit. I think Steve had his hand up before the rest of the questions. Steve, would you like to turn on your mic and ask your question?
Yeah, this is more of a philosophical question, perhaps, but I've been an architect for almost 40 years, and we've been through court cases and presented cases about people who thought we were removing parking and fought us tooth and nail. And now it just seems like everybody's rolling over and saying, okay, we don't need any parking anymore. It seems to me that there's going to be a huge backlash when these parking, groups realize what's going on, and nobody's going to have a place to park it. People would argue that now nobody has a place to park. you're getting rid of all these on-site parking places. I just wondered if you guys had thought about this. It just seems like in a year or two, there's going to be a huge backlash. I mean, these ordinances go, in waves. And when the cities realize, oh, we screwed up, we got to, address this somehow. Any ideas about that?
Yeah, I think I'm sorry, Mark, and jump in.
Yeah, go ahead, Jason. Yeah.
I mean, I would say that's one of those, your mileage may vary kind of thing. And that's why, I mean, I spent time both in NorCal and SoCal, and I personally am having a hard time seeing or making ADUs work in especially in a multifamily setting where I'm going, yeah, I can take away these carports, but then now say I have a fourplex with 4 parking spaces, and I go to let's say a 6plex with 0 parking spaces, right? Like, I am going to have a hard time leasing those units, even if people are willing to park on the streets and all that. I mean, it's one of those things where sure, the laws and regulations are in place for that, but maybe free market will still exercise its own judgments, and it totally could be an issue depending on how good your transit system is. In LA, there's certain areas, with metro line stops, it's probably more conducive for this, but I mean, yeah, like if so many people are relying on their car.
I guess the most of the clients that we're working with own enough units that don't have parking already that they're more comfortable with it. Most of the stuff we're working on in LA is very centrally located. A lot of the buildings, are from the earlier half of the 20th century and are under parked to begin with, and so they've already got units that don't have parking, and they're not having a hard time. I mean, maybe literally right now they're having a hard time renting them, but historically we're not having a hard time renting them. I do think if you get out into like the valley or something, if you're in an area with no street parking and you're not providing any parking on site, then yeah, you're going to have a really hard time leasing those units. It really just depends on the local context a lot. I mean, even in like San Diego has parking maximums downtown now, of all places. So, things are changing. I think people's expectations of like how many, there's a lot of buildings that were built with 2-to-1 parking ratio, and many households, even in LA, don't have 2 cars now, especially if it's like a younger couple and one of them's working at home.
Okay, great. And then is it Teo? Would you like to ask Mark your question?
Sure. I was just curious as to what do you, when you do these conversions in a multifamily building, what do you have to do with the local utilities like gas, power, water? Is there anything added you have to do with them, or approval from them, or fees?
There's some caps on impact fees that were part of that legislation that passed last year. Particularly as far as like sewer impact fees were really a huge one in a lot of places. So there are some caps on those fees. We generally would never recommend somebody install gas in a new unit. It's incredibly expensive, and it just adds a tremendous amount of coordination if you have to put in additional gas meters. So typically in the multifamily units, every unit needs to be metered for everything unless you have some kind of a shared heating system with a boiler, in which case you could include that in the rent. So we typically though just do the units all electric, and then we have to add electric meters for them. Sometimes that triggers an electrical upgrade, but a lot of older buildings really need an electrical upgrade anyway. It's pretty common to see, a fairly large apartment building with a 200 amp panel. So you're not actually going to be able to even do a lot of major unit renovations unless you upsize that anyway. So that's usually like part of the scope of the project. Most buildings don't need a sewer upgrade, or like a water meter upgrade unless for some reason you end up having to add fire sprinklers.
How about solar? How does that come into, because California has the whole new residential units need to be solar ready or have solar, but then some the multifamily, it could be detached or it could be within the existing building.
That's a great question, because that is really severely curtailing people's interest in doing detached ADUs, because it does apply to detached ADUs. If it's a ground up new construction building that's not in the footprint of an existing building, then you have to put solar on that unit or on the main building to account for that unit. And that can be like a $15,000 or $20,000 addition to the cost of building it. If you build out, if you convert a garage or a carport, or if you rebuild an existing accessory structure, you don't have to do PV. And so a lot of people are trying to go that route and avoid the PV.
Honestly, I mean, for stuff I'm looking at more at single families and detached garages, because I mean I haven't been keeping up with the cost up in the Bay Area, but at least in LA, you're talking about say 55 to 75,000 to convert a garage versus, like, I don't know, I've seen people done it in like say 110, 130, but I always usually tell people budget 200. And it's like half the time, half the cost. So
yeah. No, I mean, it is true that the conversion is usually much cheaper, especially in light of where lumber prices have gone in the last year.
Yeah.
And and you skip that immediate cost of doing the PV system.
Yeah. So let's see. Two, and then Natalie, do you want to ask a question about the addresses?
Yeah, I just had to unmute myself. Yeah, so when I've been going around looking at properties with ADUs, some have their own addresses, like it's 317 and a half, and some don't have an address, a separate address. So is there any benefit, like what is making the city prompt them to have their own addresses, and is there a benefit to having an address, or is it?
Well, most cities require it, and the post office requires it. When you see ADUs with really weird addresses, a lot of times those ones were not permitted. But in a lot of cities have a step that's part of the building permit, like either a certificate of occupancy, or when your permit's being issued, they have like an addressing exercise that you have to go through, and they usually like let you pick a number, but it does need its own address because the person living there is going to receive mail. And the exact process though is going to differ a little bit depending on how your local building department handles it, but it should be part of that process.
I mean, I guess to answer your question, Natalie, like there's not a whole lot of benefit other than maybe privacy or sorting out the mails. But as you go through the process, it is required by the city to have addresses or separate addresses.
So ones that don't have an address then aren't permitted.
Likely, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it's also a really big deal for the fire department in case there is a call to that building, because they want to be able to tell where they're going. So
they can just tell by which one is actually on fire, or
well, if it's a medical call, it might not be quite so obvious. Yeah, so I'm saying a heart attack.
Cat stuck on a tree, like Pleasantville, if everybody know the movie I'm talking about. Okay, and let's see, we're gonna try to wrap up here, but we do have some folks that have multiple questions. If we can go, Lakeisha, do you want to ask a couple more of your questions? I just want to be fair with everybody to get to everybody at least one round.
You guys have given so much information, I can't even remember what all my questions were. The funding was a big one, and you guys touched on that. If there's any incentives, I know like the city of Santa Cruz is offering like forgivable loans and grants. I have two properties I'm looking at. One is in Riverside County and one is in LA County that I own free and clear, and I really didn't want to have to take a loan out to do these projects, but if there's any other incentives or other programs you guys are aware of, you can share those.
Yeah, I know like the Silicon Valley Housing Trust has a loan program, but I think it's oversubscribed right now. Yeah, this is a really common question, and there's not a lot of great answers right now because, you know, a lot of people, you know, don't want to take out a construction loan to do one of these projects, or it's almost impossible to take out a construction loan in some cases to do an ADU project. And there's not a lot of ADU specific funding programs out there. There's a few like local credit unions that have them. Umpqua Bank is sort of sympathetic to ADU development, but yeah, I don't know, other than that Silicon Valley Trust, I don't know of any, other than like cities have maybe waived or reduced permit fees and done some much smaller things like that. I don't know of any like really good subsidy programs for creating the units.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the couple of remaining hurdles for ADUs or accelerating the adoption is the financing, and it all kind of ties together is because like ADU is new, so there's not a lot of comps or things that properties that sold or traded on the market, so they can't properly assess the ARV or the after value, and then lenders don't want to lend on it, and that's because, and then that prevents people from getting financing and building them, and which, you know, also slows down the comps and the adoption.
I would say there's a big difference. Like if it's a commercial loan and it's a multifamily property, then adding the ADUs is totally fine because when you're done with the project, they're just additional units and you're going to be evaluating that based on their rental income. But in the sub 5 unit buildings, there actually is no appraisal standard for an ADU. And so people are finding that they're being appraised at anywhere from literally nothing up to the per square foot value of the main house, you know, just depending on where you are and who's appraising it. And it makes it really stressful kind of figuring out like how you're going to finance it and what you're going to do with it long term.
Yeah, and one thing too I learned recently was relating to the, you know, 1 to 4 units and then 5 plus, say like you get a duplex and you added 3 units, like a JADU within the duplex and 2 more detached, but now you're in 5 unit category, and that's a whole different loan and whole different kind of financing option that your future buyer has to consider, and it could change your exit plans a little bit. So be mindful of that. Or say like you get a triplex and then build 2 detached. Again, you're crossing from that 1 to 4 to the 5 plus category. And actually, I missed a question of asking, or if I said that thing correctly, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. I was just asking about the feasibility studies. What do they include and how much do they cost typically?
We actually do a lot of these because people often approach us and have no idea like what they could do, or they hadn't really considered it, and then they hear about multifamily ADUs. You know, for smaller projects, you know, we have some sort of minimal kind of fixed fee options where it's like $500 or $1,200, depending on whether you want some sketches or like kind of a very rough fit plan or not. But it would include like a site visit and planning code and building code analysis, et cetera. For larger properties, you know, we usually take it on a case-by-case basis and kind of look at, you know, how many existing units there are, how big is the site, you know, and that's more in the like couple $1,000 range to come up with a plan, because we often end up having to meet with the planning department on a Zoom call or something to kind of go over the options. The smaller properties though are more in the like $500 to $1,200 range.
Great. Does anybody have any other questions? Okay, cool. I hope you guys found this useful. I'm gonna pop in the link for the Facebook group here again, for our multifamily master group. You know, it's not just about ADUs, it's just general forum, and you know, people ask all kinds of questions from you know, all kinds of properties across the country that they may be getting stuck on. Let's see. A couple house, but yeah, I'll get the slides from Mark and send it out to everybody. And usually, as a for folks that can't join, or if people want to rewatch it, I do host it or upload it to my Google Drive, so you can take a look again. I feel free to reach out to me. I'll put my contact info here. But let's see. We usually meet the last Wednesday of each month. I have 2 speakers where I'm in the works right now for next month. One is just more about, growing your portfolio and scaling your business. And then I have another developer. He's in the co-living space that would love to get him on a schedule because he's a pretty busy guy. But definitely, join our Meetup group so that you'll be alerted for all the latest topics that we have coming. We do try to keep it pretty diverse, pretty interesting as well, instead of just kind of rinse repeat. Like, this is how I went from 5 units to 200 units kind of thing. So hope everyone found this was helpful. And again, feel free to reach out to me or the rest of the group for anything you need help with or stuck on in terms of ADU or just real estate in general. Tell your friends, and hope to see y'all next week. Next month.
Thank you, guys. Thanks.
Thanks for the invite. I really appreciate it. Reach out to me if you have any questions about the presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So
great.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, everyone.